Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Kim Rogers especially for putting together this conference for us and for working with me on this unusual arrangement so that I could be with you all here today. My name is Chelsea Kelly. I hail from the University of Georgia, and this is Discordantly Meaningful, Examining Cognitive Mechanisms of Culture and Action. This whole conference we have this weekend is on the exciting new directions in affect control theory research. One of the first steps, though, in making new strides is to go back and verify foundational basics, sometimes for the very first time. This presentation will offer evidence for one of these nitty-gritty verifications. As the processes of cognition have thus far been considered an inextricably interwoven whole, we have not examined nor parsed out the relative weights of affective sensibility and institutional sensibility for the assessment and acceptance of social events. Furthermore, we may have conflated these mechanisms' effects over time, giving too much credence to the significance of the deflection reduction mechanism. So to remedy this, I'll offer evidence of a robust test of deflection reduction free from this conflation, as well as evidence from a three-condition experiment that attempts to parse out the relative weights and operation orders of these two mechanisms as they work in concert to guide cognition. I then discuss necessary next studies and the future directions of the tools of affect control theories. Okay, so these are the tenets of affect control theory. That people operate their emotional and cognitive assessments of social interaction so as to reduce deflection, and the deflection is the social discomfort that's experienced in an event when the scenario doesn't follow the mental script that the assessor presumes it should. People desire that the does of human behavior make itself match the should of human behavior, not the other way around. So a person who observes someone who they think is a mother act terribly to a child doesn't tell herself, oh, okay, I've been wrong thus far in my life about who mothers are. Given the evidence in front of me, I can expect people who are mothers who I see in the future to be horrible to children, and this is what's going to happen from here on out. People don't do that. They say, oh, she's a terrible, terrible mother. People change their understandings of the social event until their expectations and their experienced reality mesh, and people use the impression equations to do this. But though the assumptions of affect control theory specify that the process of deflection reduction operates in accord with psychological projection rules or institutional constraints of society, this is not codified in the tools. The 9 basic impression change equations, one each for the E, P, and A of the A, B, and O, rely solely on the operation of the desire for deflection reduction. The equations allow us to plug in identities and behaviors as variables, solving for X to find out things like who might do what and to whom they might be doing it. So here's the equation for the power of an actor after an event. For the sake of explanation, if we ignore the Tichy numbers, we get this simplified equation. And this equation says in word that people are considered powerful after they act if they were powerful to begin with and if the behaviors that they performed were powerful ones. All 9 of the equations can be verbally expressed in this way because each is simply the numerical representation of various cultural expectations. So people are working to get the reality of the world to align with their ideas of the world, and we capture this process with equations depicting it. So far, all well and good. But we do not know the extent of the power of this deflection reduction mechanism to drive behavior, because we may have thus far conflated its effects with that of institutional sensibility of the events in which it operates. When constructing events for studies, particularly when selecting low deflecting events, we have a wide variety from which to choose. We do not normally choose to create irrelevant noise in our studies, so we often take care to select low deflecting events that are particularly institutionally sensible. However, the ideal low deflecting events are not the only low deflecting events, so our quite reasonable practice may have conflated the abilities of the two to guide respondent assessments. This begs the question, when isolated from the effects of event construction, does deflection remain a significant predictor? That's what the study I'm about to describe seeks to answer. Before I get into the design of this study, I want to address the definition of deflection itself. The format of the experiment I described doesn't rely on a participant understanding it, but in a test of its power is worth us discussing. So deflection has been discussed as likelihood or frequency or normativity. I'm approaching deflection here in a broader application as social non-strangeness. I'm hopefully trying to capture deflection itself rather than a proxy for deflection. So this is how I'm discussing it, as implausible, surprising, abnormal versus normal, socially plausible, unsurprising. If deflection really works as we say it does, if it truly guides designations, evaluations, and choices, then it does so without our help in composing events. How does one test this? Rather than have respondents rate researcher-constructed events, I had them act just as equations do. I had them take an unfinished event and effectively solve for zero effectively by filling in the event blank like a Mad Lib. So walk through this with me. This is a depiction of the three-dimensional EPA space where identities and behaviors may be located. I selected a representative identity and behavior from each octant of EPA space, as well as from the origin, and I set each of these identities as actor and as object to each of the others for a total of 81 A blank O events. I then asked respondents to supply for each event the most appropriate behavior for each of the actors to do to each of the objects, using the 9 behaviors as their word bank from which they were allowed to select their choices. These were the identities and behaviors that I selected. So if you look here at the letters on the left-hand side, that'll just tell you like HHL means it has high E, high P, low A, and that would be a behavior like soothe or an identity like psychiatrist. I used fields of terms in presenting these questions so that people wouldn't fixate on a particular verb. I wanted them to get the feel of each of the groups of choices. So it's not soothe, it's soothe, listen to, calm, caress, cuddle. Each of the words that follow the anchor term is from that same area of EPA space, but I used the first term as the one from which to determine distance. I predicted counts of behavior selection by overall deflection score of the event the behavior choice would create. If affect control theory's mechanism of deflection reduction is a definitive predictor, then respondents should choose from the possible behavior choices the one that is closest in EPA space to that of the mathematically optimal deflection reducing behavior for each of the 81 events. This is better understood with a visual. So this graph here depicts the locations in EPA space of each of the 9 behavior choices that someone is allowed to select. Those are the blue dots. That orange dot there shows, for this instance, the mathematically optimal behavior for a janitor to do towards a janitor. So when the respondents are given the event janitor blank janitor, and they have these events they have these behaviors to choose from, if deflection is what predicts it, then we would expect them to choose obey because it is closest in EPA space to the optimal choice. I generated optimal predictions using the Hanover equations validated in Heiss's 2015 Quality and Quantity article, as well as with the newly estimated Bayesian-based equations, which would look like this for the same event. They're quite close. In order to analyze data like these, the data were arranged in an event by behavior structure, with aggregate counts of the number of respondents who chose that response for that event, forming a dependent variable for a negative binomial regression analysis. Deflection score was the main independent variable of interest, but because respondents were allowed to select on behaviors, I controlled as well for BE, BP, and BA. As you can see, results showed that deflection and BE were statistically significant predictors of behavior selection. Thus, along with the expectation that nicer things happen more often than not, respondents were more likely to construct events that lower the event's overall deflection score. To apply this result to a concrete example, a behavior that creates an event with a high deflection score, something like a father abducting a baby, 65.6, it'll be chosen by 95% fewer respondents than will a behavior that creates an event with a lower deflection score, something like 6.5, a father snuggling a baby. For deflections estimated by the Bayesian estimates, the coefficient was even a little higher. Unequivocally, as event deflection rises, likelihood of selection falls. Deflection comfortably works, which is very good for us. Deflection alone is not the only predictor. With the advent of affect control theory of institutions, we can unravel the relative contributions of deflection and adherence to the rules of social interaction. How do these mechanisms work in concert? I've done a test of this, which I'll be presenting in a little more detail at ASA, but I'm going to describe it here briefly so that I can talk a bit about future directions. I conducted an experiment with events that were either institutionally concordant or low deflecting, divided them by condition, and had respondents rate them on their likelihood, normalcy, social reasonableness, capturing deflection. So these are the 3 conditions. And I have a representative event from each of them to kind of give an example. The critical point on these was that every individual was given events from only one of the conditions, and then the respondents were asked follow-up questions as to why they rated the events the way that they did. This allowed me to ascertain how they saw events as problematic or acceptable by condition so that I could analyze the differences. Those of you who were at group processes last year saw the nascent stages of this research, but bear with me because it's now complete and the analysis is actually highly informative. So in contrast to affect control theory predictions, but consistent with the affect control theory of institutions, respondents reported that high deflecting but institutionally concordant events seem more plausible and more likely than low deflecting institutionally discordant events. In the graph here, this first row is showing you that these are both the events that are institutionally concordant. One's high deflection, one's low deflection. The second row is showing you testing institutional concordance. So the events in this row are low deflecting. The first one has institutional concordance, and the second one does not. The third row shows you the difference of deflection versus institutional logic's effects on respondent ratings. In analyzing the qualitative responses that justified the ratings, the patterns varied by condition. Where events were low deflecting, respondents stated facts. Respondents had no problem deciding that events that were not institutionally concordant were not likely at all. But deflection mattered still. Institutionally concordant events were rated likely because, to paraphrase the respondents, that's how it is. That's what happens. Institutionally discordant events were rated unlikely because that's not how it is. But for the condition that was institutionally concordant and highly deflecting, respondents justified those ratings. They told stories, and the stories that they described about the events showed that they had reinterpreted and relabeled the events in context, and those resulting redefinitions had much lower deflection than the original event. And it is this redefined event that's low deflecting that respondents then rated as likely. So the concordance sets the stage first, and then deflection comes in behind the scenes to make it happen. To account for the non-independence of the respondent ratings, I used a linear mixed model testing the effects of institutional concordance and event deflection score on respondent ratings. I found that while institutional concordance does account for the lion's share of the difference in likelihood ratings, deflection was still highly significant and had nearly a 1-to-1 ratio with likelihood ratings. To give that example used previously, that father abducting baby high deflecting event would be given a likelihood rating about 48 points lower on a 100-point scale than would that low deflecting event, something like father snuggles baby, even after accounting for the incredibly predictive nature of an event's status as institutionally concordant or discordant. Institutional logic is paramount, but deflection remains highly predictive. The processes occur in rapid succession. This test of ACT's mechanism of deflection reduction with ACTI's mechanism of institutional concordance offers a clearer picture as to how these two processes are interwoven, and it shows that it is indeed possible to parse out the components of the cognition process. Now that we know this, though, we've got further questions to unravel. Is there a cultural hierarchy of institutions? That's what we have to answer first. If we're going to integrate it into the equations and account for this in our predictions, we need to figure out how. When is there a pan-cultural one? When medicine is pitted against law or law against family, which one's going to win out? And does that vary? I imagine this element will be far more reliant on individual social position than is affective judgment. We'll have to figure that out. Even beyond this, we have stickier elements to unravel, like what specifies the status of an event as institutionally concordant or discordant. You have some certain things like transitional identities. People like bakers or travelers or receptionists whose role within their institution is to interact with those outside of it. How do we account for that? Unbounded institutions, things like family identities, where someone in another rigidly controlled institution can also have family identities, and how do we account for those? Evaluation of valence of the behavior. A lot of our highly deflecting events are highly deflecting because the behaviors are extremely negative. Or we have institutionalized behaviors. So an intern can command a surgeon, even though it's affectively deflecting to do so, it's plausible. But the intern can't arrest the surgeon unless the intern is also some sort of law enforcement officer. And arrest and command have affectively similar ratings. How do we figure out those kinds of things? In what way do we specify it? What gets weighted in what way? So perhaps some incubator session or late night dinner this weekend can tackle those questions. But regardless of the questions that still remain, with the advances of affect control theory over the decades, we can no longer talk about affect captured in deflection and institutional concordance as specified in ACTI and partially accounted for in the new Bayes Act estimations as inextricable processes of cognition. We must account for their differential impact and incorporate the new information into the steps from here forward. Thank you.